Welcome back to Preaching and Teaching the Old Testament. We want to continue by focusing on the inductive narrative sermons. We looked at deductive, basically the three different varying styles of deductive. We're going to focus now on the inductive. Biblical problem, biblical solution. This is the first one. Sermon title, How Can Believers Overcome Barrenness of Leadership? Notice, prayer is not in the topic. It was in the topic of the title of the three deductive, but this is narrative. And part of narrative that makes it unique is the suspense. We don't know what the solution to the problem is. We don't want to give away the solution in the sermon title or in the MPS. We want to inductively come to that MPS. So with a biblical problem, biblical solution, we start with the biblical problem, which is barrenness, not the solution, which is prayer. The solution is not retaliation. And then we do, like we do with the deductive, we explain, argue, apply, and illustrate. Main division 2. The solution to our problem of barrenness is prayer. Then again, we would explain, argue, apply, and illustrate. And that would lead us to the third main division. The solution to our problem is giving our best to the Lord. This is based on a different kind of plot. We mentioned the simple plot. One problem, one solution. The complex plot, like the simple plot, is based on the problem-solution pattern. We're going to look at 1 Samuel 1. That's our example. Again, you have a beginning, you have a middle, and you have an end. The conflict, as we have referred to, Hannah could not bear a child. She's going to give birth to the first of the three leaders that are sovereignly raised up in the book of 1 Samuel. Samuel. Then Samuel will anoint King Saul and King David. But there's a conflict in this book, 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, where God sovereignly raises up leaders, Samuel, Saul, and David. It opens with barrenness. The mother who's going to produce the first of these three sovereignly raised up leaders is barren. There is a conflict. But we know the conflict is solved when Hannah has a child. But then in the middle, there's a new conflict or turning point. She vowed to give the child, the man-child, to the Lord if the Lord gave her a man-child. And the Lord did. After the child was born, Elkanah wanted to go to the place of worship, take Samuel as Hannah had vowed, and dedicate him to the Lord. She says, not until he is weaned. New conflict. Is she going to keep her vow? Is she going to keep her word? And we find out she does. She takes him to the temple, to the place of worship, dedicates him there, and he spends the rest of his life in service to the Lord. End of conflict. But this complex plot will affect the form of our sermon. The form of the Scripture should influence the form of the sermon. So let's see how this affects the sermon. How can believers overcome the barrenness of leadership? Not through retaliation. Explain, argue, apply, illustrate. The solution to the problem is prayer. But then you had a second conflict But that conflict was resolved when Hannah gave her best to the Lord, her son. And so you can see how the biblical problem, biblical solution may be based on a simple plot or it may be based on a complex plot. But here's another variation. Again, this is a slight variation, but nevertheless, it would be a good alternative or change once in a while. Same title, How Can Believers Overcome Barrenness? The solution to barrenness is not retaliation. Notice, no Roman numeral 1. No number 1. The outline is hidden. We don't emphasize the outline. We don't say point 1 or number 1. There is a problem. Number 2, there is a solution. No, we tell the story. This really enhances the story. There's no outline to distract from the story. But you're just doing it is no different from the biblical problem, biblical solution, except you're not emphasizing the outline. You're going to emphasize the problem. You're going to emphasize what the solution is not to begin with. Explain, argue, apply, and illustrate. And then you're going to emphasize what the solution is. It is prayer. But then we have a second conflict. And you're just talking your way through the sermon. You're preaching that passage. In this second part, you will do the same 4 rhetorical processes. And that'll lead you to the solution to the second conflict, which is giving our best to the Lord. And again, you will have the same 4 rhetorical processes. This is the hidden outline narrative. It is inductive because the solution is in the middle and the second solution is at the end. The difference between the hidden outline and the biblical solution, biblical problem, biblical solution is the outline is not stressed. The main points, main divisions, subdivisions are the same but not emphasized. The hidden outline sermon adds variety. The preacher follows the same biblical problem, biblical solution. The preacher will mention the problem but not as point 1. The preacher will mention the solution but not as point 2. It's just a good variety. And variety is the spice of preaching. Narrative applications. All right. Same title. You're going to just walk your way through, preach your way through the scenes. You still have the same main divisions. The solution is not retaliation. Explain, argue, but look what's missing: the application, the illustration. Because we're going to hold off those. We're going to hold those applications and illustrations to the very end. That'll give you variety. That way your sermon will end up with a big push for application. Again, you'll walk your way through the scenes or the main divisions. You'll explain and argue. By argue, I mean just adding some scriptural references. That's what we're talking about when we say argumentation. And then the application that would have been here, you pull it down here. The illustration that would have been here, you pull it down here. Application, illustration. Same thing with the point 2 or main division 2. The applications and illustrations that you would have had here, you still have them. You could build the sermon the same way and then just rearrange it. Pull the application to down here. from your second main division, pull the illustration from your second main division down here, and do the same thing with your third main division. You're just giving a big emphasis on reproving, rebuking, exhorting at the very end. I mentioned a sermon by Chuck Swindoll on David and Goliath, and in the notes that you read for this week, that's what he did. Told the story of David and Goliath, and then gave the applications at the end. Just a nice little variety. These are called 3 indirect sermons that are based on the parabolic preaching of Christ. I'm going to go to that. Luke 12. This is one of Jesus' parables. It says, this is in those who write on narrative preaching, talk about indirect application. What we just talked about was direct application. But they came up with narrative sermon styles that are indirect, and based on Luke 12:21. So Jesus tells this parable of the rich fool who built barns, tore them down, built bigger ones, and then in Luke 12:20, God said unto him, You fool, this night your soul shall be required of you. Then whose shall those things be which you have provided? In the parable. But the very next verse is application by Jesus. So, listen to this application. So is he that lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. One application. What I want to do, I want to take what homileticians call indirect sermons. They would basically say, tell the story, make no applications. But I don't think that's preaching. Preach the word, be instant in season, out of season, reprove, rebuke, exhort with all long suffering. Reprove, rebuke, exhort. That is application. This is promoted by John C. Holbert. A pure narrative sermon is just that, a narrative. In other words, a pure narrative sermon is a story, no more, no less. That's the first of these 3 indirect sermons. He would say, start at the beginning, end at the end, tell the story, make no application. I want to modify that. This sermon it's called pure because it has no introduction or conclusion. But I want to modify that and say, yeah, every once in a great while, do a pure narrative, if you choose. No introduction, no conclusion. Start at the beginning, end at the end, but add one application. That's how we're going to differentiate our pure narrative from those who would advocate no application at all. How can believers overcome barrenness? Tell the story based on the crisis solution pattern. Biblical problem, biblical solution. The solution is not retaliation. You can make that emphasis as you preach through this passage. You can explain it. You can argue it. And you come to the next main division. The solution is prayer. You explain it. You argue it. The third main division, the solution is giving our best to God. And then one application at the end. Believers can go to God in prayer and give their best to God. And then one story illustration. That would be a nice variety in preaching. And I would say, once in a while, do that. Break out of the mold and do that. The frame, this would be the second indirect application sermon that these homileticians stress. Frame, what the pure A pure narrative is framed with an introduction and a conclusion with one application at the end. That's our modification of it. Very simple. You're basing it still on beginning at the beginning, addressing the conflict, giving the solution, which will be the main point at the end. But it has an introduction. It could be your typical introduction with a tension step and interest step. And then again, you would go to your first main division, explain, argue. Second main division, explain, argue. Third main division, conclusion with application and illustration, just like in the pure, except the big difference is you've added an introduction. And you can stress the conclusion, but this is basically your conclusion here. Just a little variety in how to preach these narrative sermons. You have the first person sermon. These are very, very rare, especially in our circles. But they are out there. First person narrative tells a story in character. Third person narrative, which we typically preach, tells a story as an observer from without the narrative. The book of Nehemiah is first person narrative. If you want to practice, that would be a good book to start. I really like Nehemiah chapter 3, where he's walking around the walls that are down and giving a guided tour on the work site. You could just tell it like Nehemiah is telling it, as Nehemiah in character. Haddon Robinson's defense of first-person sermons. Preachers assume that sermons take only one shape and that no matter what genre the biblical writers use, the preacher must refashion it as a sermon. We would say most commonly a deductive sermon. But that is an alternative. The first-person narrative. Relive it, don't just retell it. The story in character such as Hannah or Eli, based on the crisis solution pattern. So you want to use biblical illustrations prior to the story, because you're telling it as the person. Let's say you want to emphasize that Elkanah committed polygamy, and you see the consequences of that, the dire consequences of polygamy. We go back to Abraham in Genesis 16, who, with Sarah's permission, added Hagar to himself to be his wife. And my goodness, we're suffering the consequences of that today. That way you could use an illustration, but it needs to be prior to the time you as first person are telling that story. The sermon's big idea is applied to the ancient audience, but at the end, the preacher may step out of character and apply the sermon to his modern audience. If you don't want to have a sermon with no application, step out of character. You're facing the audience, you're giving this first person, you turn around, and then you turn back and you face them as you, the preacher. That's one way. It's just a unique way of maybe once in a great while preaching. Here's some first sermon examples. This is in Haddon Robinson's book, Biblical Sermons. He has a book, Biblical Preaching, but he also has a book of biblical sermons. There is a first person there, and another one by Donald Sanukian on Esther. Incredible. And so also Paul Borden's autobiography of the Apostle Paul. And that's audio. And if you're interested, I'll tell you how to find that. those are the different ways that you can do the inductive sermons. The last one is inductive deductive narrative. And if we look at not 1 Samuel 1, but 1 Samuel chapter 2, it's based on what is called a chiastic structure. On the Greek letter chi, shaped like an X. You've seen this if you've studied narratives. It's not, this is not limited to narratives. But there's a parallel, an inverted parallelism in this. And you can see it, the Song of Hannah concluding with reference to the Lord's anointed. Look at this, look at the parallel. The oracle of the man of God concluding with a reference to the Lord's anointed. They're parallel. That's intentional. That's a literary device. And you just keep coming down. Samuel ministers before the Lord. Samuel grows before the Lord. The sins of Eli's sons. The sins of Eli's sons. Samuel ministers before the Lord. Samuel grows before the Lord. Eli blesses Samuel's parents. Focal point. It's like this literary device is bringing the focus to the middle. And we can see this in chapter 1 of 1 Samuel. Believers cannot solve their barrenness with retaliation. Look at the focal point. In the middle, believers can solve their barrenness with prayer. Then you have this new conflict, but the new conflict is resolved. That way, you want to inductively lead up to the main point and then deductively develop it. Again, you're explaining, arguing, and applying. So I hope this is